Let's talk about running backs that you should start or sit in week 7 of the fantasy football season. Keep in mind, we have the Ravens and the Bills on bye. So no Derrick Henry, no James Cook, but I'm going to go through all 15 matchups, 30 teams in total. You can actually pause your screen and go to a specific matchup if you want to hear about it. There's also time codes in the description as well to help you out. And last thing here, I'm guaranteeing a reply to the first 3 comments of every video this year. So make sure you're subscribed and you've turned your notifications on. Okay, let's jump into Thursday Night Football. We've got the Steelers at the Bengals. This will be in Cincinnati. Obviously, the big news between these two teams is the Joe Flacco trade last week. And that definitely significantly helped the Bengals offense as a whole, but it didn't really change much for the running back room. In fact, Chase Brown might have potentially lost a little bit more work than any of us were anticipating, because typically when the Bengals are down in games, they were utilizing Chase Brown out of the backfield as a receiving threat. But this week, for the first time in a while, we saw Samaje Perine with 3 targets compared to 2 for Chase Brown. Chase Brown only having 11 total touches compared to 9 for Samaje Perine. Chase Brown was actually pretty efficient on the ground for the first time in quite some time. 9 carries, 42 yards. That was awesome to see. The offense is going to be better, but if they're going to be consistently down in games and we're going to see a lot of Samaje Perine, that could really limit Chase Brown's upside on a week-to-week basis. But I think he's a spot start at this point. Right, if they get there in on the goal line, he'll have an opportunity. He's certainly not someone that you're starting with confidence. You're hoping that he gives you somewhere between 8 to 12 fantasy points, and you're kind of happy with that floor. On the opposite side, this is a great matchup for Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell. This is the best matchup for your fantasy running backs this year through 6 weeks. Now, speaking of split backfields, we did see Jaylen Warren when he missed that game overseas. We saw Kenneth Gainwell step in and look like prime Alvin Kamara. I mean, he looked incredible. And the concern for Jaylen Warren was, well, will we see Kenneth Gainwell have a bigger role after the bye week? And we kind of found out that, yeah, he will have a bigger role, right? In this latest game on Sunday, Kenneth Gainwell had 6 targets and 6 carries, while Jaylen Warren had 11 carries and just 2 targets. And obviously, we all know targets are more valuable than carries are. However, Jaylen Warren's still out there, 31 snaps compared to 20 for Kenneth Gainwell. This was also a game where they were up for the vast majority, so we don't know what that will look like if it's a more competitive game here on Sunday. I would label Jaylen Warren a must start just because the matchup is too good to deny. But obviously, with an eye on Kenneth Gainwell, like, damn, is he really going to start taking these opportunities? And if you're in a really desperate situation, then Kenneth Gainwell is not the worst desperation play flex if you have so many injuries and buys out there. Okay, let's move on to the London game. We've got the Rams at the Jaguars. 45.5 point over under. The Rams are favored right now by 3 points. That could change depending on, Puka Nakua's status throughout the week. But Kyren Williams is going to be a must start. Blake Corum actually injured himself in last week's game. So I imagine if there's any lingering effects, we will see a heavy dose of Kyren Williams. But the Jags are a pretty good defense. It's just good offense versus good defense. Typically, you start that running back with Kyren Williams, right? Now, on the opposite side of the ball, it has been a couple of really bad games back-to-back for Travis Etienne. It's not that he's not getting opportunities. It's just that the offense is not converting on those opportunities. And Travis Etienne isn't converting on those opportunities, right? Here in this latest game, you can see he still had 17 total touches. We like to see that, but it only turned into 9.5 fantasy points. So that's back-to-back weeks where he's been underwhelming for fantasy football. It's also a really tough matchup against the Rams. They are the 3rd worst matchup for your fantasy running back. But honestly, at this point, you still have to put Etienne with the amount of touches that he's getting, with how good this offense is starting to become, with Brian Thomas starting to turn a leaf. There should be more scoring opportunities, and it should be a high-paced game for the Jaguars. Okay, let's jump to the start of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time slate of games on Sunday. Starting off with the Saints at the Bears. 45.5 point over under here. The Bears are favored by 4.5 points, coming off that huge win on Monday Night Football against the Commanders. Makes me sad to think about as a Commanders fan, but they pulled it off. Good for them. The weather was crazy. But let's start with Alvin Kamara and this Kendre Miller situation. Okay, Alvin Kamara last week, a little bit of a tweak of his ankle. There was concerns if he would play or not in that game. He did end up playing. He led the team in carries and obviously led the team in targets, as well as snap rate. getting 15 total opportunities compared to just 9 for Kendre Miller. So while it hasn't been the greatest year for Alvin Kamara, I do think they're still going to stick with him as their RB1, giving him the majority of the opportunities on the ground, in the air. Kendre Miller will be a spell back, but because the matchup is so good, the Bears are the second best matchup for your fantasy running back. I do think Alvin Kamara should be a must start. He should be in the majority of your lineups, especially with all the injuries that we're dealing with. Kendre Miller more of a Hail Mary at this point. On the opposite side of the ball, how about DeAndre Swift, man, having his best day probably as a Bear ever, averaging 7.7 yards per carry against the Commanders, had that receiving touchdown as well, 67 receiving yards, 25 fantasy points in PPR leagues last week. Look for him to build off of that. You know, there was maybe some concern even from myself if we might see Kamananga get more opportunities after the bye. That did not happen because DeAndre Swift looked fantastic. And maybe they finally found their way in the run game after the bye week. Maybe they found some tweaks, right? But DeAndre Swift has got to be in your lineups. Okay, let's go to Dolphins at Browns. 39.5 point over under. The Browns are favored by 2.5 points. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Browns are favored by 2.5 points. For the first time this entire year, the Browns are favored. Probably the last time this entire season. But it makes sense because the Dolphins are an absolute mess. Maybe even more of a mess than what the Browns are at this point. Okay, so here's the good news for Quinshon Judkins, right? He's had most of his games where he started over 20 touches. The bad news is last week, for the first time in a long time, we saw Jerome Ford heavily used when the team was down, right? Judkins had just 13 opportunities. He didn't convert it into a big fantasy day, just 3.6 fantasy points. Meanwhile, Jerome Ford was out there for the vast majority of the passing work, had 23 routes run, ended up with 5 targets. That's a little bit concerning because the Browns have been down in the majority of their games this year, and you haven't seen them go away from Judkins. This is the first game this year they have gone away from Judkins. A little bit concerning, but the good news is he gets to face the Dolphins, the same Dolphins who last week let Kamani Vidal look like an absolute superstar, scoring over 20 fantasy points. So Judkins should have an incredible bounce back this week versus a very good matchup in the Dolphins. On the opposite side of the ball, of course, you start Devon Achane. We all know that he's a fantasy superstar. You can't sit the kid, right? Okay, let's move on to the Raiders at the Chiefs. Ashton Jeanty is going to be a must start in this matchup. Yeah, it's not the best matchup, and you know I can hear you guys where you're coming from if you have some concern. But we're talking about Ashton Jeanty, who has had 15 or more fantasy points in each of his last 3 weeks. Obviously, the big week in week 4 versus the Chicago Bears. But last week, getting into the end zone, 75 rushing yards, as well as 11 receiving yards. He's being used on the ground, in the air. He's one of the best weapons for the Raiders, and they're going to keep utilizing him. Now, it is a little bit concerning that the Chiefs are 10.5 point favorites. That's a concern. But in recent weeks, we've seen this team feature Jeanty in the air. So I think there's enough floor there to, kind of play Jeanty without any concern. Now, as far as the Chiefs go, I think we know what this backfield is going to be at this point. It's going to be a full-blown committee, right? If you're a Pacheco owner, you've been concerned all year that Kareem Hunt is taking opportunities on the goal line. And then last week, the one goal line opportunity Pacheco's had this year, Patrick Mahomes runs it in for a touchdown. He could have easily pitched it to Pacheco for the touchdown, but he doesn't, right? So it's a complete split backfield. Obviously, Pacheco is starting to get more and more of the work on the ground. You love to see that. But they're still going to use Kareem Hunt in short yardage situations. They say they want to get Brashard Smith more involved. So I would say Pacheco and Kareem Hunt, both risky starts. But there are some trends that are, encouraging for Pacheco as he's getting more and more work each and every week and looking pretty good with that opportunity. Okay, let's go to the Eagles at the Vikings. 42.5 point over under, a little bit low. Eagles are favored by 2.5 points, even though it's in Minnesota. Saquon Barkley, obviously hasn't been the guy that you drafted him to be just yet. A little bit of a down first, 6 weeks. No games over 20 fantasy points. No games over 100 rushing yards. That's definitely disappointing, but you don't sit a guy like Saquon Barkley. It's not the best matchup against the Vikings, but he just can't be on your bench. On the opposite side of the ball, I do think you can start Jordan Mason. Obviously, no Aaron Jones. This should be a much more competitive game than people are realizing. It's in Minnesota. That's obviously great for Jordan Mason. And with no Aaron Jones and the Eagles, so many injuries with their defense, right? They're actually the 7th best matchup for your running back. So I do think Jordan Mason is a playable name. Okay, let's move on to the Panthers at the Jets. I imagine a lot of you guys are going to have big questions about this backfield in Carolina. Just so you know, the Jets are currently favored, but it's a close spread, one of the closest spreads of the week. I am labeling Rico Dowdle a must start. Now, that is assuming that Chuba Hubbard is not available to go. So if Chuba Hubbard is practicing and then he ends up being active, I'm going to kind of change those rankings slightly. Rico Dowdle would go from my RB13 to my RB21, so still in the must start category. And then Chuba Hubbard would be my RB26, more of a spot start. Now, we've talked about this a lot this week. I just don't see a scenario in which Rico Dowdle is not an important part of this offense moving forward. I don't know how a guy who has over 450 all-purpose yards in 2 weeks and is one of the biggest reasons why you've won back-to-back games, he's kind of saving Dave Canales' bacon right now. I don't see how that guy's not an important part of your offense. Now, shout out to David Newton of ESPN. He actually asked David Canales, like, hey, do you think Rico Dowdle has earned the right to be the starter? And all David Canales said is, we'll see. Maybe. So he's not closing the door to it. If anything, if you own Chuba Hubbard, it's definitely concerning at this point, right? He missed 2 opportunities to smash in great matchups. And obviously now with Rico Dowdle doing its thing, it's hard to say that this is going to be Chuba's backfield. So it's very messy. But best case scenario, there's no Chuba Hubbard, you start Rico Dowdle. Worst case scenario, Chuba Hubbard's a spot start at best, a flexible name if you're in a tough spot, and you can still start Rico Dowdle regardless. I just don't see Rico Dowdle not being an important part of this offense. On the opposite side of the ball, Breece Hall, you can start him. It wasn't the greatest day for Justin Fields and this entire offense, obviously, but they face the Panthers. It's a good get-right game for Breece Hall. And it's going to sound strange, but with Garrett Wilson out of the game, who else are they going to target outside of Mason Taylor and Breece Hall? So I would not be shocked if Breece Hall ends up having like 6 targets in this game and really gives you a safe floor in fantasy football. Now, look, guys, injuries have been chaotic this year. The NFL fantasy football has had so many of them. If you want to know my latest up-to-date rankings, both for weekly and rest of season, then all you have to do is use my promo code LAND and buy the season pass on the Flock site. That will give you unlimited access, not only to the site, the rankings, the trade calculator, all the great premium tools, but it will also give you some vouchers to come on our live stream and ask us fantasy questions. So check that out in the pinned comment. Okay, let's go to the Patriots at the Titans. This Patriots wide receiver room is about as disgusting as it gets. No matter how inefficient Ramondre Stevenson is, no matter how many times he fumbles the ball, they are committing to using Ramondre Stevenson. Doesn't matter if Travion Henderson, if we all think he's going to be the better option, the better weapon for the Patriots. It really doesn't matter. This team is committed to Ramondre Stevenson. So at best, I labeled both of them spot starts. Obviously, you have my rankings for every player in this video. Ramondre's at RB27, Henderson at RB30. I would love to tell you, like, this is the game. This is the game where Henderson breaks out. I just don't know how many times we can really say that anymore. I mean, even last week without Antonio Gibson, Travion Anderson only had 30% of the snaps. He played just 19 snaps, right? 11 total opportunities. I just don't know what would have to happen for this team to feature Travion Henderson. Yes, it's a great matchup, right? The Titans are a top 5 matchup for your fantasy running back. But if I had to bet on one of these names, it's still Ramondre Stevenson. So Ramondre is a fine start if you're in a tough spot. It's a good matchup. So he has every chance to bounce back. I just don't know when Henderson's going to really be featured. Now, for the Titans, there's a lot to talk about with the Tennessee Titans. So first things first, they fired their head coach. No surprise about that. Brian Callahan really had a lot of fumbles, a lot of questionable interviews where we weren't really sure if he actually knew the rules to the game. Now, last week was the first time this entire year where Tajay Spears clearly outsnapped Tony Pollard, 36-26 snaps. Tony Pollard led the way in carries, but Tajay Spears had 5 carries on the ground and 5 targets through the air. And if this team is going to be down in games and Tajay is going to be their preferred pass catching back, what does that mean for Tony Pollard? Well, we don't even know if this is what they're going to do anymore because they just fired their offense coordinator, their head coach, everyone who calls plays is out of the building, right? So we'll find out a lot about this backfield this week. For 9 out of 10 people watching this video, I would prefer for you to completely avoid this backfield entirely. It's not a great matchup. None of them are really standing out. It's not a good offense, brand new coaching staff. I don't know what to project for this offense moving forward. Okay, start of the afternoon slate of games. We got the Giants at the Broncos, 40.5 point over under. The Broncos are heavy favorites in this game. Cam Scatterboo, man. Yeah, I thought Tyrone Tracy would be more involved when he was back than what he was, but it was a Scatterboo show, and I don't think it's going back, right? I think this is Cam Scatterboo's backfield for the rest of the year. He had 74% of the snaps last Thursday night, had 21 touches, 3 touchdowns, over 5 yards per carry. The guy's an absolute dog. I know it's a bad matchup, but you can't sit him. He's used in the air, on the ground, on the goal line, and without Malik Neighbors, I mean, he's just such a great target for this offense. He's a great pass catcher. We saw that at Arizona State. You just can't sit a guy like Cam Scatterboo, even in a bad matchup. He's the dude in this backfield. He is the guy. On the opposite side of the field, same thing can be said with J.K. Dobbins. I know he's coming off a game that wasn't that great versus the Jets. That entire offense looked pretty weak, to be honest, but he is still the highest snap share, opportunity share guy in this backfield, and the Giants are a pretty decent matchup, so Dobbins has to be in play for most of your lineups. Now, RJ Harvey, I know everybody's waiting on the breakout. I don't know if it's going to happen if J.K. Dobbins stays healthy, guys, because not only does RJ Harvey have to deal with J.K. Dobbins and how well he's playing, but he also has to deal with Jaleel McLaughlin. Sometimes it's Tyler Bidet. They're rotating in different running backs and just kind of taking away opportunities from RJ Harvey, even when it should be his time to shine. So too many cooks in the kitchen. It's only Dobbins, and that's it. Okay, let's move on to the Colts at the Chargers. I don't want to waste too much time on this. Of course, you start Jonathan Taylor. We all know that. It's a very high over-under. There should be a lot of fantasy points in this game. On the opposite side of the ball, we found out a lot about the Chargers backfield this last game versus the Miami Dolphins, where Kamani Vidal was the dominant player in this backfield. It's funny because Mike Garafolo, I believe, tweeted out before the game last week for the Chargers that Hassan Haskins was expected to be the lead back. Couldn't have been further from the truth because we saw Kamani Vidal come out here, have 67% of the snaps, 72% of the rushing attempts, 56% of the routes run, 11% target share. I mean, he was the dominant guy in this backfield, but as Dwayne McFarland notes, you know, obviously we thought the same thing with Michael Carter after his first week with no Trey Benson. So obviously that's disappointing to see what happened in Arizona, but I think this team has made it very clear that they prefer Kamani Vidal the rest of the season. So I am going to label him a must start and what should be a very high scoring game. And I don't think Hassan Haskins can really be considered in your lineups. Okay, another week for the Packers, another week for Josh Jacobs to really convert on this great schedule he's currently in. The Cardinals are the 8th best matchup for your fantasy running backs. Josh Jacobs is on a dominant streak right now. Back-to-back games with multiple touchdowns, back-to-back games dominating on the ground. Packers are heavy favorites, almost 7-point favorites, even though it's in Arizona. So this should be another great game for Josh Jacobs. On the opposite side of the ball, I am going to go ahead and say that if I had to start one of these names, it would be Bam Knight. Now, what we saw happen in Arizona was when Amari DeMarcado suffered his ankle injury, the Cardinals moved Michael Carter from the first and second down role to the third down pass catching specialist role, right? They kind of swapped roles, and then they put Bam Knight in that first and second down role. That's why you saw Bam Knight with 37 snaps compared to 32 for Michael Carter. You saw him getting more of the rushing attempts, and Michael Carter getting a vast majority of the carries of the targets out of the backfield. So if you had to choose one of these names, it's going to be Bam Knight. He's a spot start flexible name at best. It's not a good matchup. Both of these guys are going to get opportunities. This is very messy. 9 out of 10 people, I would suggest to avoid this matchup entirely with the Cardinals running backs. But if you're in a desperate spot, there are worse options for sure. Okay, let's talk Commanders at Cowboys, the highest over-under of the week. Commanders are favorites, even though it's in Dallas. And yes, unfortunately for Bill Krosky-Merritt, it wasn't the game that we really wanted him to have, was it? On Monday Night Football. For the first time this entire year, the Chicago Bears defense actually looked pretty competent against the run. They were shutting down Bill Krosky. They were shutting down this entire run scheme. Here's the good news. Career high in touches for JCM with 18. 18 total touches. We all know how explosive and dynamic JCM is as a player. And if he's going to see 15 plus touches for this team every single week, then he's going to be a must start every single week. I know it didn't turn into a good fantasy day. I'm disappointed just like you guys are, but it's a great matchup. a high-scoring game we should see here with the Commanders and the Cowboys, two of the best offenses in the NFL. So I'm going to continue to put Bill Krosky into my lineups and anticipate much better fantasy days ahead. Chris Rodriguez was dealing with an injury last week, didn't really play at all this week. And, it's getting more clear. That's what I'll say. It's getting more clear for Bill Krosky, and there's plenty of reasons to be excited long term. As far as Javonte Williams goes, you got to put him into your lineups. Dominant guy in his backfield. Great offense he's a part of. Plenty of goal line opportunities. He's that dude. Okay, let's go to Sunday Night Football. We've got the Falcons at the 49ers. 45.5 point over under. The 49ers are favored at home by about 3 points. Bijan Robinson, I mean, what more can you say? Absolute superstar performance from him on Monday Night Football. 170 rushing yards. And then adding on to that, 68 receiving yards. The dude is an absolute fantasy superstar. Tyler Algier in games when they are up is going to be a startable name, but you can't count on that week in, week out. Last week got into the end zone, but only averaged 3.2 yards per carry, only 32 rushing yards in total. So he is a desperation play at best, even though he could get into the end zone every once in a while. On the opposite side of the ball, of course, you're starting Christian McCaffrey. For as long as he can hold up, he will be our RB1 in our weekly rankings, right? I mean, the guy is an absolute can't miss start. Okay, let's go to Monday Night Football. We have another double header this week. Starting off with the Bucs at the Lions. Should be a very exciting game for fantasy purposes. Tied for the highest over-under of the week. Lions are favored at home by about 5.5 points, which makes sense. They're at home. They typically play their best at home. Everybody's going to have fun if you have a player in this game, except for the Bucky Irving owners, right? Todd Bowles came out early this week and said that they do not expect Bucky Irving and Chris Godwin to be in play for Monday Night Football. So this early in the week, already ruling out Bucky, not exciting, not really what you want to see, but it is great for the Rachaad White owners. He will have another week where he is a, dominant usage running back and one of the best offenses in the NFL. It makes me sick seeing what Bucky Irving could have done for fantasy football, but Rachaad White has been fine. He's not been uber efficient, but he's been a decent weapon in the air, and he's getting plenty of goal line opportunities. So you got to start Rachaad White in such an exciting matchup, right? If for whatever reason, somehow a miracle happens and Bucky Irving plays, then of course we're going to start Bucky Irving and Rachaad White becomes more of a spot start, but I just don't anticipate that happening. All reports are that Bucky's not going to be available. On the opposite side of the ball, it was a down week last week for both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. But the great news is the Bucs are a top 10 matchup for your fantasy running back. It's the highest over-under of the week. There's a heavy spread in favor of the Lions at home. There's every reason for this to be one of those games where Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery just dominate for fantasy football. So I'd be shocked if there's a lineup out there in most of your 12-team, leagues where you're sitting these two names. So just before we get into our last matchup of the day, here are 6 players I'm rocking with in my DFS lineup this week. Debo and JCM at Dallas. It's the best matchup for your fantasy wide receivers. Obviously, we don't know Terry's status at the time of recording this. Bill Krosky, I think he's going to bounce back after a career-high touches last week, but a disappointing game. Rashee Rice, first game back. Adunze with DJ Moore being injured, and then obviously a safe floor with Taylor and CMC. That's what I'm rocking with. You can create your own lineup on the Quick 6 Super Slam contest. All you got to do is download the FastDraft app, use my promo code LAND. I'll match your deposit up to $50, and then you're going to get my week 7 rankings completely free. So you can check that out in the pinned comment if you want to have some fun. Okay, last game of the week, we've got the Texans at the Seahawks. It's a 41.5 point over under. The Seahawks are favored by about 3 points. There's a lot to talk about in this matchup because there's a lot of unknowns at this point. Actually, let's talk about the Seahawks first, because we do know what this backfield is going to look like in Seattle. This is what they told us they wanted to do before the year, and they're committing to it. And honestly, if you have Ken Walker, I understand why you're frustrated, but I don't think this is going to change. Another week where Ken Walker has pretty much the same amount of opportunities as Zach Charbonnet. It doesn't feel like they're going to change this anytime soon, if ever, this entire year. If both of these guys stay healthy, I just don't see them changing this, guys. So in the last 3 weeks, we're looking at 47, 56, and 60% of the snaps for Zach Charbonnet. And this team is wanting to air it out. and they trust Charbonnet as a pass blocking running back. For Ken Walker in the last 3 weeks, 50, 44, and 35% of the snaps. Snap share going down every single week. Now, last week, Charbonnet was not that efficient, right? He had 24 yards on 12 carries, but it's not like Ken Walker was efficient either. Had 34 yards on 10 carries. So neither of these guys are being very efficient. This team is loving throwing the ball right now deep down the field. I'm not really comfortable starting either of these names. Texans are a pretty good rush defense. So both of these names, if you have a better option, I'd prefer to sit them, but they are spot starts at best. And we're coming to the point where you don't really know which one's going to outscore the other, right? Because Charbonnet is getting more of the goal line opportunities. Ken Walker is doing more on a per touch basis. And there's just no indication that this team is going to switch things up. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, it's a pretty decent matchup for Woody Marks and Nick Chubb, a top 12 matchup for your fantasy running backs. Obviously, we're coming off the disappointment before the bye for Woody Marks, where he faced the Baltimore Ravens and it was the Nick Chubb show. Now, after that game, D'Amico Ryans came out and said Nick Chubb and Woody Marks, their usage is going to be dependent on game plan and game flow. And the running back coach has a big part to play in that. Now, think about that. If the flow of the game is important, then in games where you anticipate it being close or the Texans needing to come back from behind, you should probably be starting Woody Marks. And that's what I would anticipate in this game, a game that's in Seattle where the Seahawks are favored. The Seahawks offense has been firing on all cylinders. Texans have been sputtering a little bit, except obviously they beat the brakes off of the Rams before their bye week. I would anticipate that Woody Marks has another decent game. I'm saying anywhere from 10 to 12 PPR points. I think he gets more involved in the air, on the ground, and I think they'll need him more in this game than they did in the previous game. However, Nick Chubb, if you need a floor play, of course, he always has a chance at a touchdown on the goal line. Well, I appreciate you guys watching the video. Do me a favor, hit the like button to show some love. Subscribe if you like the content, and I'll see you guys in the next video. The next video being the wide receiver start sits, which will be out later on the channel, so make sure you check that out here in a couple hours. Draft with me every night this week on the FastDraft app, where there are thousands of dollars to be won weekly. Getting started is easy. Download the FastDraft app, use the promo code LAND at signup to get your deposit match up to $50. That's up to 10 free entries on us. And when you finish your first DFS contest, I'll send you my weekly rankings completely free. Check out the link in the pinned comment to start drafting today.